spiritual awakening itself is a kind of death. A deep awakening. There's all sorts of different awakenings, by the way. You know today where everybody uses the same word and they all think they mean the same thing? Awakening. You know, I mean, awakening, it's occurred to me that even the term awakening, which used to mean something, now I even wonder what it means, because nowadays it's gotten into the popular culture, kind of. Do you know what I mean? And so now it's like, you know, if you misplaced your orange juice behind the carton of milk in the refrigerator, and then you find the orange juice, you go, I've awakened to the orange juice that's behind the milk, you know. It's overstating the case, but not by much, you know. So everything can become a moment of awakening nowadays, you know, because we're so quick to try to use the phrase. But in Zen, they have a term for spiritual awakening, which is the great death. And I think to call it the great death is actually very honest. It's very true to often the deep experience. And like the deep experience my father was having, the experience of the great death is a completely paradoxical experience, because it is a death. There's no doubt about it that it's a death. Unless there's a death element to it, then it's just a momentary passing experience that will usually leave you wanting more passing, well, hopefully not passing, but more spiritual experiences, do you know? But when it has a death component to it, you very much feel like you've lost the person that you thought and felt and imagined and believed in just a few minutes before. It's a kind of psychological death. And I'm sure you guys do enough meditating in this room. I imagine everywhere I go I meet people that have these sort of inner experiences. You bump into sort of an inner sense of some sort of void that feels like it might want to annihilate you. Anybody have that kind of experience? Yeah, okay. Shaking heads. No hands. Nobody wants to admit, but lots of shaking heads. You know, if you sit around long enough, or maybe not even very long for that matter, you can enter into these dimensions in your consciousness where you really meet up with what's at the very center of consciousness. Certainly at the center of egoic consciousness is a void. Not a theoretical void, but an actual experience of a void sitting there at the very core of our own consciousness. When you come up against it, it can be very frightening. Because the only way that the conscious mind or ego knows how to relate to that is that if you go into it, if you went into that space, that it would be annihilating. You'd never make it out. And so it's very common that they meet this kind of space and then they pull back. And they meet it and they pull back. And it seeks to almost annihilate them and then they pull back. And then when they pull back, it's not very long before they come searching out someone like me and say, tell me the whole story of it, and then say, how do I get back there? You know, as if I want another chance. I want another chance to really let go. Do you know? Really, really let go. Because what you're meeting at those moments is you are meeting a death. It's not just an imagination. You are meeting a kind of, you're changing from one dimension of consciousness to another. But the old you doesn't go from one into the other. The old you doesn't make the transfer. Right? And so that's why often there's this extraordinary sense of silence and a kind of unknown inner territory that can present itself. and then the survival instincts often kick in. I've often thought this is actually a slowed down version of this is what the Buddha was encountering under the Bodhi tree. Under the tree of life, the Bodhi tree is really the tree of life, which is, you find it in almost every religion, there's some version of the tree of life. Sitting under the tree of life, and he starts having a dying experience. And of course, when he dies and he starts going through all these experiences, his temptations, his fears, they all sort of come up as he's because these are the things that these are like the heavy artillery. When you're really going to let go and it's getting kind of out of hand, what is your psychology going to pull up? Something very deep that's going to get you to say no, or it's going to pull up your deepest attachments. Right? One of Buddha's deepest attachments was actually to society, to performing his duty in society the way he was taught to do it. That was a huge thing at his time. That the role you have in life is the role that you're supposed to occupy, the role that you're supposed to carry forth. You're supposed to be that person. It's good for you. It's good for society. And how dare you don't do that? That was a really big thing in his culture to run up against, as well as temptations and fears and all the rest. This is slowing down the whole death process as he's meeting his mind's reasons why not to let go. This is too frightening. You can't let go in the face of that. But you still want to accomplish this, right? You still want to be successful or loved or approved of or whatever. All these deep psychological forces come to the fore. As they will whenever someone meets their own kind of death. These deep psychological forces will start to arise as if to say, well, are you sure you want to do that? Are you really sure you want to let go? Letting go is all safe and everything as long as it's at a surface level. But when it gets down to a real core level, kind of existential level, it starts to mean and feel like it means something very, very different. It starts to feel like if I let go at this depth, that I will never make it back to seeing life exactly the way it was before. And when you let go at that depth, it's true. You won't make it back to seeing life quite the way you did, the way you saw it before. It's funny how many people forget that that's exactly what they were endeavoring to do, you see, from the very beginning, right? That's what they were trying to do, right? To see life in a different way. And so it's ironic that when even you taste any of this, it does have the effect of a kind of extraordinary, almost like an explosion of vitality. Again, the paradoxical nature of death and birth, life and death, really coming together. And when they really come together, or when we let them come together, there's something really quite powerful and amazing that can happen right at that juncture. Right? To really let go. And so often meditation is a sort of, it's a dress rehearsal. You sit down, you're already endeavoring to do all the things, to let go, to relax, to not be so attached, to just not be so involved in your mind. All this is death stuff. This is conscious letting go. Conscious letting go is conscious dying. Not that your heart's going to stop beating. That's that's not nearly as significant as what we're talking about now. But then there's strangely this incredible vitality that can be connected as these two forces within us are allowed to join. Of course, they're already together in the deepest sense. Whenever we come upon something that's feels profoundly significant, profoundly freeing, there's always an element of a lens that we no longer see through. Right? It's always sort of just like a lens change. And some old lens falls away, and all of a sudden we see life without that coloring. But we like our coloring, do we not? As much as it's disturbing it is, at least we can sort of wrap our identity around it. You know what I mean? We like the coloring. We like our self-definitions. Not all of them. Some of them we'd really like to get rid of. Some of them we really like to hold on to. But I've often thought a death, whether it's physical or a sort of psychological or spiritual death, both of them are sort of new births into new realms, new ways of being. But I've always thought that to let go, to really deeply let go, simply leaves you with sort of one way of being. My dad's way of summing up that one way of being was simple. I love you. No matter what happened, I loved you. We got to take you to the rehab center. I love you. We got to leave you here. I love you. How's it going? Fine. I love you. Do you know what I mean? The ego mind is, I love you when, I love you if, and I love you under these conditions. Do you know? And so I'm often reminded of the Buddha's story of his awakening just before he sat under the tree, when he had that memory of when he was a child. And when he was a child sitting on the banks of a river, like we do when we're kids, maybe adults too if we're lucky, just laying in the grass by the side of a river, feeling the sun warming his head and shoulders and the breeze and the sound of the river, and he just sort of fell into this natural sort of reverie. And all of a sudden, here's this little kid, and he just feels this, for a moment, he felt this sense of absolute freedom and well-being. Complete freedom and well-being. Absolutely happy. Not a care in the world, as light as a feather. And then, about as quickly as it came, it passed, and he had to get up, and he had to do something, and he forgot about it. For all these years, all of his seeking, all of his striving, all of his meditating, he'd totally forgotten about it until he gets to the river, despondent, basically starving to death. He's wrung out, right? Literally almost physically dead from starvation, psychologically spent. He'd given everything to the search, and this is what it had come to. Nothing. Do you know what I mean? Okay, here's a guy who's ready to let go. He's ready for death. Everything else has been sort of a warm-up act. This is the real act now. And then he has this memory. Oh yeah, I remember laying on the bank of the river in the grass. And I remember having this sense of such freedom and expansion and well-being, and I did nothing for it. I just laid down there on that side of that riverbank. That's all I did. I didn't know where I was going. I had no agenda. I wasn't trying to make anything happen. I was just a kid after all. I was laying on the bank of the river. That's the memory he has just before he goes up and sits under the Bodhi tree. It's a really important story. Otherwise, you misread the Bodhi tree story, because usually the Bodhi tree story is the Buddha saw the Bodhi tree and he thought, I'm going under that tree and I will not move and I will not leave it until I achieve enlightenment. You've probably heard that, right? And that gives you one impression, doesn't it? It gives you the impression that is very common for us to have. Okay, he got really determined and he wasn't going to leave until he got it. And he was all like ready to go and fired up and this was going to be the moment, and by God he had the great breakthrough. But what's left out is what contributed to get him under that tree, which is the simple memory of an easy childhood experience of being very free and light and happy, and that he just laid under that. He just laid in that grass, wasting time. And my sense when he got and sat under that tree is the reason that memory is told in the story. Because my guess is he sat under that tree a lot like he sat next to that river when he was a kid. And I think everything leading up to that was what was preparing him to enter once again into that simplicity. Right? Because as adults, we can enter into the same simplicity as children, but we do so with a whole host of and years of human experience behind us. And so it's different when a kid just sits under the tree not knowing what they're doing, and an adult sits under a tree knowing exactly what they're doing. And a kid that just sat there with not much of a care in the world, and an adult like the Buddha that came under the Bodhi tree that sat there after he'd sought and sought and sought and sought and sought and went to all the teachers of the day and was actually somewhat respected in that sort of community, but he wasn't personally satisfied. And he touched upon again what he touched upon when he was a little kid. But this time he was an adult with a whole host of experience and desire and attachment and all the rest, and so that's what arose for him. And letting go, that was a kind of death, because a lot of them were a scene of how life could be. If you only did this, life could look like this. If you only did that, life could look like this. If you only did that, then look what life could look like. And they were all things that he was saying no to. He was basically entering into a kind of, we call it letting go, but letting go at this level is a kind of death, because letting go is going to the core of you. When you're starting to let go of the core of you, the way you know and recognize yourself, that's a kind of death. When you let go of things out here, that can be difficult enough, but to let go of the very thing that's holding on to all the other things is a very, very deep thing indeed. And yet it's there in all of us. It's there in every single human being. And so in my father's case, when various diseases removed the future from him, he could have gone one of two ways. He could have tightened up and started kicking and screaming and resenting and being angry and why did life do this to me? And he could have went that route. Some people sadly do go that route. But for whatever reason, I suppose he just had enough of all that. And he went another route. as he was dying. As he had most of what we would think good reasons to suffer and to resist, you know. Everything that was familiar to him was being taken away from him. And yet, why was he so damn happy? Right? Why was he so happy? Everything was being taken away. Convenience, he was having to be taken care of like a child again. You know, all these reasons to be upset were present. And yet, and so I've always felt that spirituality is actually simply a way of speeding up a natural process. It's just speeding up the developmental process. I remember my teacher used to say, oh yeah, waking up and enlightenment is just the next thing after adulthood. If it all goes right. Not that you have to be a physical adult, you know, because what you realize is that doesn't have much to do with it. You know, we can be 70 years old and a spiritual infant, you know, or we can be 10 years old and a spiritual sage, and vice versa. You never know. Our physical age doesn't always equate to our, certainly not our spiritual age. But something within us often feels like certain conditions really need to be met to just drop resisting. Or something needs to disappear from our consciousness. Our mind needs to be more quiet, or we need to feel a certain way. All these conditions need to be met for me to stop resisting, you know. But of course, we all know the same thing. We all know those conditions will never be met for very long. Have you noticed? It's one of the things about growing up is you kind of start to open your eyes and you realize all the conditions I put on my own happiness, none of those conditions are going to be met for very long. Brief times, yes. For moments, yes. But, you know, overall, the conditions we put on our own happiness, that we impose upon our happiness, that we say, I won't be happy until this is the way I want it. You know, it's never the way you want it for a long time. You know? It's another way of saying impermanence, you know, but that can be kind of abstract.